Do you fear the mirror's betrayal? The slow rot of time claiming your youth? You spend millions to hide the decay, yet the mask always slips. In this story, you will learn the true cost of eternal beauty and why some secrets are better left buried. The scalpel didn't just cut, it whispered. Edmund Sterling felt the vibration of 300 years of history traveling up the silver handle and into his steady, surgical fingers. In the subterranean silence of the British Museum's restoration vault, the air smelled of formaldehyde and the dry, suffocating dust of empires. Before him lay the remains of Lady Isabella, a 17th-century duchess whose skin had been preserved by a freak of chemistry in a lead-lined coffin. To the museum, she was a specimen. To Edmund, she was a canvas of exquisite, uncorrupted texture. He didn't see a corpse. He saw a heritage. Chuki. His fingers brushed the parchment-like surface of her shoulder, and a jolt of electricity hit him, a vision of candle-lit ballrooms and the damp chill of a London winter. He wasn't just restoring her. He was reclaiming her. With the precision of a master weaver, he began to peel away a 4-inch strip of her thigh, his breath hitching as the alive history of the dermis yielded to his touch. The conflict wasn't in the act, but in the ticking clock. The night watchman's heavy boots were already thudding in the corridor above. Edmund's heart didn't race. It slowed, fueled by the cold adrenaline of a man who believed he was saving the past from the indignity of rot. "Mr. Sterling, are you still down there?" The voice of Arthur, the young security guard, echoed down the stone stairwell. Edmund didn't flinch. He carefully slid the strip of Lady Isabella's skin into a vial of amber-colored preservation fluid. He had been doing this for months, harvesting the greats of England to stitch together a map of a lost world. But tonight, he had been greedy. He had taken too much. As he wiped the bloodless incision and draped the linen shroud back over the Duchess, the heavy iron door creaked open. Arthur stood there, his flashlight beam dancing over the rows of jars and ancient statuary. The light caught the glint of Edmund's scalpel. In that moment, the silent pact between the restorer and the dead was broken. The boy's eyes widened, not at the body, but at the fanatical, icy blue stare of Edmund Sterling. There was no explanation for the vial tucked into the pocket of a bespoke Savile Row suit. Edmund didn't wait for the questions or the inevitable horror. He moved with a serpentine grace, vanishing into the labyrinth of the basement archives, just as the alarm's shrill scream tore through the museum's hallowed halls. 3 weeks later, the damp fog of London was replaced by the suffocating, artificial heat of Los Angeles. Edmund stood on the balcony of a secluded villa in the Hollywood Hills, looking down at the carpet of neon lights that stretched toward the Pacific. He loathed this city. It was a city of ghosts who refused to die, a place where people traded their souls for a tighter jawline and a smoother brow. But it was also the perfect laboratory. Here, the obsession with the now blinded everyone to the then. He had opened the Heritage under the guise of an exclusive underground tattoo studio, but he never used ink. The wealthy elite of Beverly Hills didn't want art. They wanted the impossible. They wanted to shed their sun-damaged, plastic-filled husks and wear something real. Edmund looked at the vials he had smuggled across the Atlantic, the skin of dukes, poets, and queens. To these Americans, it wasn't history. It was the ultimate luxury brand. He would give them what they craved, but he knew what they didn't. Skin has memory, and it does not like to be transplanted onto the unworthy. His first client in the City of Angels was Evelyn Vance, a silent film star's granddaughter whose face was a roadmap of failed surgeries. She sat in his velvet-lined chair, her eyes pleading for a miracle. Edmund leaned in, his silver-gray hair caught in the clinical glow of the surgical lamp. He didn't offer her Botox or fillers. He held up a small, translucent patch of skin, the velvet soft cheek of a young Victorian girl who had died in her prime. "This," Edmund whispered, his voice like dry leaves, "is not a procedure. It is a coronation. You will not just look young, Evelyn. You will carry the grace of an era that knew the value of a legacy." He began the grafting process, his slender, skeletal hands moving with terrifying speed. He wasn't just a surgeon. He was an architect of the grotesque. As he stitched the ancient British skin onto the fresh American muscle, he felt the first stirrings of the enzyme he had perfected, a catalyst designed to fuse the two worlds. He smiled, a thin, predatory line. The merger of oceans had begun, and as the elite clamored for his touch, Edmund Sterling knew that soon the past would no longer be buried. It would be walking the streets of Los Angeles, screaming to be recognized. The waiting room of the Heritage had become a cathedral of high-stakes vanity, a sterile sanctuary where the sun-bleached elite of Los Angeles huddled like cattle in couture, desperate for the miracle only Edmund Sterling could provide. Edmund, a 58-year-old Caucasian male with pale, translucent, almost waxy skin and sharp, icy blue, analytical eyes, moved among them with a silent, predatory grace that suggested he was measuring them for more than just a procedure. His 6'1" ectomorphic, slender, skeletal frame was draped in a bespoke Savile Row charcoal suit under a crisp white laboratory coat. His silver-gray, slicked-back hair shimmering under the recessed lighting as he examined the fading complexions of the world's most famous faces. He was no longer just a technician of the flesh. He was a god of the dermis, and the stakes had transcended mere cosmetic enhancement to become a biological arms race. To possess a sterling graft was to possess a piece of the old world, a biological inheritance of British aristocracy that no amount of American money could normally buy. Yet beneath the porcelain-smooth surfaces of his clients' new faces, a subtle, rhythmic pulsing had begun. A phantom heartbeat that didn't belong to the host. The elite were intoxicated by the results, ignoring the way their new skin felt perpetually cold to the touch, even in the blistering California heat, and how it seemed to tighten not with the elasticity of youth, but with the restrictive, suffocating grip of a Victorian burial shroud. They were trapped in a cycle of adoration and burgeoning agony, unable to retreat because the very tissue that made them beautiful was beginning to hunger for the blood that fed it, creating an impasse where the price of beauty was the slow, agonizing erasure of their own biological identity. By the third week of the heritage craze, the first whispers of the stiffening began to circulate through the gated communities of Bel Air like a viral ghost story. It started as a faint, metallic taste in the back of the throat and a sensation of being watched from within one's own mirror, a feeling that the face in the glass was a stranger wearing a mask of your own features. Evelyn Vance, the pioneer of Edmund's macabre art, found that she could no longer smile without her skin emitting a sound like ancient parchment tearing, a dry, rasping noise that echoed in her inner ear. She rushed to her usual Beverly Hills surgeon, a man who had built his career on silicone and hope, demanding he remove the British graft that now felt like a leaden weight on her soul. But as the surgeon pressed his laser scalpel to her jawline, the beam scattered harmlessly against a calcified layer of history that defied modern physics. The skin of the Victorian girl had not merely rested upon Evelyn's face. It had sent down microscopic, root-like tendrils of ancient, vengeful DNA that had woven themselves around her facial nerves and fused directly with the bone of her skull. The biopsy results were a nightmare of biological anomalies. The cells were active, aggressive, and possessed a mitochondrial signature that predated modern medicine by centuries. suggesting the skin was not just living, but evolving. There was no fixing it. To remove the skin was to remove the person, leaving behind nothing but a raw, weeping husk of muscle and regret. Edmund had ensured that his legacy was permanent, a symbiotic prison where the host was slowly being overwritten by the guest, leaving the elite in a state of terminal perfection. They could neither survive nor escape. Edmund sat in his Chelsea-inspired loft above the studio, his aquiline, thin, aristocratic nose hovering over a petri dish containing a sliver of an 18th-century Earl, his thin mouth set in clinical detachment as he observed the enzyme's progress under a high-powered microscope. The Americans were beginning to panic, their frantic calls lighting up his encrypted lines like a terminal ward switchboard, their voices cracking with a terror that no amount of wealth could soothe. They complained of voices in the skin, of vivid, terrifying dreams, where they walked through the fog-choked, filth-ridden streets of London in 1888, feeling the damp chill of the East End in their very marrow. They begged for a reversal, a return to their shallow, sun-damaged, plastic-filled selves. But Edmund knew the impasse was absolute and irreversible. The enzyme he had perfected acted as a molecular glue that didn't just join tissues. It synchronized memories and trauma across centuries, binding the living to the dead in a way that defied the laws of nature. The skin of the dead carried the trauma of their passing, the dampness of the workhouse, the terror of the gallows, and the cold indifference of the plague. And it was now bleeding these sensations into the nervous systems of Hollywood's elite. As he adjusted his silk cravat with skeletal hands that never shook, Edmund realized the genius of his trap. The only way to dull the excruciating, soul-shredding pain of the graft rejection was his proprietary stabilizing serum, a concoction that provided temporary relief while accelerating the final integration. He had turned the most powerful people in the world into junkies for their own stolen flesh, binding them to him with a leash made of living, breathing history that they could never cut without bleeding out their own essence into the pristine carpets of their mansions. The tension reached a breaking point as the invitations for the L'Impasse Gala, the most exclusive and secretive Halloween event in Beverly Hills history, were hand-delivered by couriers dressed in authentic Victorian livery. The elite were terrified, their bodies now battlegrounds of competing eras, their faces twitching with the involuntary expressions of long-dead poets and paupers. But they were also hopelessly obsessed with the status Edmund provided. They couldn't show their faces in public without a fresh dose of the serum, and Edmund had strategically stopped distributing it, claiming he was perfecting the final stage of the merger. In the shadows of the heritage, Edmund prepared the final trigger, his icy blue eyes reflecting the rows of chemical jars containing the last remnants of his London collection. Each jar a piece of a history he was determined to resurrect in the new world. He wasn't just planning a party. He was planning a grand unveiling where the mask and the man would become one, regardless of the cost to the host. The skin grafts had reached a state of critical mass, where the donor DNA was beginning to exert physical will over the host's musculature, causing the star's limbs to move with a stiff, formal grace that was entirely alien to them. As he meticulously ironed his white lab coat, the air in the room grew heavy with the smell of old paper, copper, and stagnant Thames water, a scent that shouldn't exist in the heart of Los Angeles. The stars of Hollywood would arrive at the gala as icons of beauty, but they would leave as something else entirely, vessels for a past that refused to stay buried. Edmund picked up a silver surgical scissor, the metal cold and biting against his waxy palm, and smiled a thin, predatory line as the sun dipped below the Hollywood hills. The guests were coming, desperate for relief, unaware that the enzyme was about to receive its final command to awaken. And as the first limousines pulled into the drive, The first screams of the past began to echo through the vents of the studio, signaling that the impasse was over and the reckoning had begun. The sterile silence of the heritage was shattered by the rhythmic, desperate pounding against the heavy Victorian oak doors, a sound that clashed violently with the meticulously curated ambience of the Hollywood Hills studio. Edmund Sterling did not flinch. He merely adjusted the cuff of his white laboratory coat over his bespoke charcoal suit, his movements possessing the surgical precision of a man who had spent decades dissecting the past. When the doors finally swung open, Julian Thorne, once the undisputed king of the American box office, stumbled into the foyer, his face a frantic mask of sweat and expensive bronzer. But beneath the tan, something was fundamentally wrong. The skin on Julian's left cheek, a graft Edmund had harvested from a 19th-century Earl of Essex, was beginning to ripple with an autonomous life, the fine pores weeping a translucent, amber-hued ichor. Julian's eyes, bloodshot and wide with a primal terror, darted around the room, settling on the rows of chemical jars that lined the walls like silent, pickled witnesses. "It's moving, Edmund. Underneath the muscle, I can feel it. It's like someone is trying to scream from inside my own throat." Julian's voice was a jagged rasp, stripped of its cinematic baritone. Edmund stepped forward, his height of 6 feet 1 inch casting a long, skeletal shadow over the actor. He didn't offer a hand in comfort. Instead, he tilted Julian's head back with a cold, waxy finger, his icy blue eyes narrowing as he analyzed the rejection. The smell of the room shifted instantly, the expensive scent of sandalwood and ozone giving way to the cloying, metallic stench of old blood and the damp, sulphurous breath of the River Thames, a scent that Edmund wore like a second skin. "Control your theatrics, Julian. You are an actor, not a victim of circumstance," Edmund replied, his voice a chilling monotone that offered no solace. He reached for a silver surgical tray, the metal clinking with a clinical finality. "What you are experiencing is not a failure of the procedure, but a lack of refinement in your own constitution. The Earl's dermis is centuries more sophisticated than your pedestrian American tissue. It is trying to teach your body how to endure, how to hold a shape that doesn't wither under the vulgarity of time." Julian recoiled, his hand flying to his face where the graft was now twitching in a rhythmic, pulse-like fashion. "You told me this was a merger. You said I'd be the first of a new breed. But look at me. I look like a patchwork quilt of the dead." Edmund's thin mouth curled into a predatory line, a ghost of a smile that never reached his analytical eyes. He picked up a pair of silver surgical scissors, the blades catching the dim light of the studio. "You are a vessel, Julian. You are the canvas upon which I am restoring the lost grandeur of an empire that your culture has spent 2 centuries trying to forget. You wanted the porcelain skin of the Staffordshire elite, did you not? You wanted the immortality of the aristocracy. Well, the aristocracy does not come quietly. It demands a host that is worthy of its weight." As he spoke, Edmund moved closer, the clinical detachment of his presence creating a suffocating vacuum in the room. He could see the micro-expressions of the dead Earl surfacing on Julian's face. A sneer, a flicker of disdain emotions that Julian himself was not consciously feeling, but were being projected by the very cells that had been stitched into his cheeks. "Please, just make it stop," Julian whimpered, his knees buckling as he collapsed into a velvet armchair. "I can't go to the gala like this. People will see. They'll see the seams." Edmund ignored the plea, instead focusing on a small, amber vial labeled with a series of intricate, handwritten Victorian ciphers. This was the enzyme, the catalyst, that would either stabilize the merger or trigger the final, catastrophic awakening. He filled a glass syringe with practiced ease, the liquid shimmering like liquid gold. The gala is the culmination of my work, Julian. You are the guest of honor, the proof that the new world can finally be colonized by the old. If I stop now, you will not only lose your career, you will lose your identity. The Earl is already reclaiming the territory of your jawline. If we do not proceed with the final activation, he will simply consume the rest. Edmund's voice was hypnotic, a siren song of vanity and historical obsession. He gripped Julian's shoulder, his skeletal fingers digging into the actor's expensive silk shirt. Hold still. This is the moment where the man and the myth become inseparable. Do you want to be the star who faded into a wrinkled memory, or the icon who lived forever in the flesh of kings? The conflict in Julian's eyes was visible, the battle between a dying ego and a terrifying new existence. He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow and jagged, as Edmund pressed the needle against the pulsating graft on his neck. The room seemed to hold its breath, the very air thickening with the weight of the past as the enzyme entered Julian's bloodstream. As the plunger hit the bottom of the syringe, a low, guttural vibration began to echo through the studio. A sound that didn't seem to originate from Julian or Edmund, but from the very walls themselves. The jars of preserved skin began to rattle on their shelves, the chemical solutions within bubbling with sudden, violent energy. Julian's body arched, his muscles locking in a rigid, aristocratic posture that was entirely alien to his usual Hollywood swagger. His eyes snapped open, but the warmth of his hazel iris was being clouded by a milky, centuries-old cataracts, a phantom gaze looking through Edmund into a world that no longer existed. "It is done," Edmund whispered, his voice finally betraying a hint of feverish triumph. "The heritage is no longer a studio. It is a bridge." He stepped back, watching as the graft on Julian's face smoothed out into a terrifyingly perfect, translucent surface. Yet the twitching beneath the skin had not stopped. It had merely synchronized with Julian's heartbeat. Outside, the first of the black limousines began to crawl up the winding driveway of the Beverly Hills estate where the gala was to be held, their headlights cutting through the smog like the eyes of hungry predators. Edmund turned to the mirror, smoothing his silver-gray hair, his reflection a picture of clinical detachment amidst the brewing horror. He knew that by midnight, the elite of Los Angeles would no longer be recognized by their fans or their families. They would be the walking, breathing gallery of his stolen history, and he would be the only one left with the scissors to cut them free. "Come, Julian," Edmund said, his voice echoing in the now darkened studio. "The guests are waiting to see their new faces, and the dead are very hungry for the light." He led the stiff, transformed actor toward the exit, the silver scissors tucked neatly into his coat pocket, leaving the scent of the Thames to linger in the dry, Californian air like a promise of the drowning to come. The ballroom of the Blackwood estate in Beverly Hills was a cathedral of synthetic vanity, a sprawling expanse of glass and polished obsidian that mirrored the artificial constellations of the Los Angeles basin below. Edmund Sterling moved through the throng of the elite like a scalpel through soft tissue, his presence a jarring note of Victorian sobriety amidst the neon-drenched decadence of the Hollywood gala. Beside him, Julian was a masterpiece in motion, his skin glowing with a luminescence that surpassed the most expensive filters. Yet there was a stiffness to his gait, a mechanical precision that suggested his muscles were being puppeteered by the very grafts Edmund had meticulously stitched into his dermis. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of high-voltage lighting. But to Edmund's heightened senses, there was a deeper, more resonant vibration, the low, rhythmic thrumming of the heritage grafts, reacting to the body heat of the room's occupants. He watched with a clinical, predatory focus as the young starlets and aging moguls preened, their faces masks of borrowed history, unaware that the enzymes he had introduced were reaching a critical, volatile saturation point. The silver scissors in his pocket felt heavy, a cold weight against his thigh, as he observed the subtle shifting of the skin on Julian's neck, a slight rhythmic ripple like a worm turning beneath the surface of a still pond. He was the architect of this living museum, and the grand opening was seconds away from becoming a slaughterhouse of historical reclamation. As the clock struck midnight, the ambient music was drowned out by a sound that was less of a noise and more of a collective, visceral shudder, the sound of hundreds of individual grafts simultaneously contracting. The atmosphere in the ballroom curdled instantly. The expensive perfumes were overtaken by the sudden, overwhelming stench of the Thames at low tide, a mixture of rot, ancient mud, and the sharp, acidic bite of embalming fluid. Julian was the first to succumb, his face suddenly contorting as the translucent skin of the Duke of Buckingham, grafted only days prior, began to reject the host with violent, spasmodic energy. The actor's screams were muffled by his own throat, as the skin around his mouth tightened into a permanent aristocratic sneer, the graft pulling so hard that the underlying facial muscles began to tear from the bone with a sickening, wet sound. Edmund stood perfectly still, a pillar of charcoal-clad detachment, as the room descended into a frantic tableau of gore. Across the floor, a legendary actress clawed at her own cheeks as the skin of a 17th-century countess began to bubble and hiss, the enzyme liquefying the adhesive layer and allowing the ancient tissue to slide downward like melting wax. The heritage was no longer a secret beauty treatment. It was a sentient, vengeful history, reclaiming the bodies of the shallow and the new, twisting their modern frames into the agonized shapes of the forgotten dead. Panic ignited like a flashfire, but there was no escape from the biology of the nightmare. The glass walls of the estate became a prison of reflections, showing the horrified guests their own faces dissolving into the visages of strangers who had been dead for centuries. The grafts did not merely fall away. They animated, the ancestral skin of the British peerage twitching and curling on the marble floors like dying fish, some even emitting low, guttural moans as the air trapped beneath the layers was expelled through newly formed, necrotic orifices. Edmund waded through the carnage, his icy blue eyes scanning the room with the practiced ease of a curator, checking the inventory of a damaged gallery. He watched a billionaire film producer collapse as the skin on his chest taken from a disgraced Earl found in a London crypt shrank with such force that it crushed his ribs, the sound of snapping bone punctuating the cacophony of shrieks. The floor was slick with a mixture of champagne and arterial spray, yet Edmund's Savile Row suit remained pristine, his movements calculated and graceful as he stepped over the writhing forms of his former clients. He reached out to touch a discarded fragment of skin that had once belonged to a Victorian lady-in-waiting, feeling the familiar, psychic thrum of the past through his fingertips, a sense of completion washing over him as the merger of the two worlds reached its bloody zenith. In the center of the devastation, Edmund finally retrieved the silver surgical scissors, the blades catching the flickering neon lights with a lethal, sterile glint. He knelt beside Julian, who was now a heap of raw, pulsing muscle and exposed sinew, the heritage skin having completely detached and curled into a ball of twitching parchment at his side. Edmund didn't look at the actor's face, which was a featureless mask of red agony. Instead, he began to meticulously harvest the detached grafts, his fingers moving with the delicate precision of a restorer handling the Magna Carta. He wasn't just collecting skin. He was gathering the threads of a tapestry he intended to weave into a singular, monumental garment, a shroud for the modern world. Outside, the sirens of the Los Angeles Police Department began to wail in the distance, their blue and red lights dancing against the smog-choked horizon. But Edmund only smiled, a thin, clinical expression that didn't reach his analytical eyes. He had transformed the City of Angels into a charnel house of history, and as he began to stitch the first two pieces of the heritage together with a needle made of bone, he realized that the screams around him were merely the opening notes of a much larger, much more permanent symphony of the flesh. The bridge was built. The past was hungry. And Edmund Sterling was the only one left who knew how to sew the wounds of time shut or leave them wide open for the world to bleed into. The reinforced oak doors of the Beverly Hills mansion buckled under the hydraulic pressure of the LAPD tactical ram. But the explosive entry felt like a distant, muffled heartbeat to Edmund Sterling. He remained ensconced in the center of the ballroom, a solitary island of Victorian precision amidst a sea of raw, pulsing American muscle. The air was a thick, cloying soup of copper and expensive perfume, the scent of the heritage enzyme reacting with the ozone of the flickering neon lights. Beneath him, the floor was no longer marble. It was a living mosaic of discarded identities. Edmund's bone needle, carved from the femur of an 18th-century highwayman, moved with the rhythmic, hypnotic grace of a master weaver. He was oblivious to the tactical lights dancing across the walls, his focus entirely consumed by the map of humanity he was constructing. Each stitch was a bridge across the Atlantic, a violent reconciliation of the old world's decay and the new world's vanity. He watched with a restorer's clinical fascination as a patch of skin from a Victorian duchess, still bearing the faint, ghostly indentation of a corset, began to fuse with the fresh, collagen-rich dermis of a disgraced action hero. The rejection was not a failure. It was a conversation. The twitching parchment of the past was consuming the present, and Edmund was the silent, skeletal conductor of this visceral symphony. As the first SWAT officer rounded the corner, his boots slipping on a discarded slab of heritage skin that still vibrated with a phantom pulse, Edmund didn't reach for a weapon. He merely adjusted his silk cravat, his fingers stained with a mixture of royal blood and Hollywood ambition, and pulled the bone thread taut, feeling the psychic resonance of 1,000 years of history snapping into place. To the world, this was a charnel house. To Edmund, it was the only honest gallery he had ever curated, a place where the mask of beauty was finally stripped away to reveal the hungry, ancient truths beneath. As the tactical teams fanned out, their shouts echoing against the vaulted ceilings, the heritage skins on the floor began to exhibit a terrifying autonomy, a phenomenon Edmund had hypothesized but never truly witnessed until this moment of le déclic. The discarded grafts, once the pride of the Los Angeles elite, were now crawling like translucent cephalopods across the blood-slicked floor, seeking new hosts, or perhaps attempting to reconstitute the ghosts they once belonged to. One particular fragment, a delicate lace of skin from a Regency-era poet, draped itself over a tactical shield, its surface suddenly erupting into a series of agonizing silent screams as the pores dilated and contracted in a frantic attempt to breathe the smog-choked Californian air. Edmund leaned forward, his analytical eyes tracing the way the ancient capillaries began to engorge with the spilled champagne and arterial spray, turning the pale parchment into a bruised purple landscape of reanimated history. He realized then that the enzyme hadn't just triggered a rejection, it had initiated a resurrection. The heritage was no longer a product, it was a predator. The screams of the dying starlets, now featureless masses of red agony, provided the perfect acoustic backdrop for the wet, tearing sounds of the grafts seeking purchase on the stone pillars. Edmund felt a surge of cold, intellectual ecstasy. He was no longer just a restorer of artifacts. He was a restorer of the soul's physical vessel, proving that the past could never truly be buried. It could only be worn. He reached out to touch a piece of skin that had once belonged to a Tudor-era executioner, feeling the rough, calloused history hum against his fingertips. And for a fleeting second, The chaos of the sirens outside seemed like nothing more than the buzzing of flies around an eternal, unmoving feast. In the strobe light chaos of the police intervention, the transformation reached its grotesque zenith as the merger began to defy the laws of biology. The pieces of skin Edmund had meticulously harvested from the London vaults were not just rejecting their American hosts, they were rewriting them. A famous actress, once known for her porcelain complexion, now stood trembling as her original face sloughed off in a single wet sheet, revealing the leathery, pox-scarred visage of a 17th-century fishmonger that had been caved into the heritage graft. The mansion had become a cathedral of shifting identities, a place where the temporal boundaries had dissolved into a slurry of meat and memory. Edmund stood up, his 6-foot-1-inch skeletal frame casting a long, distorted shadow against the carnage, his white laboratory coat acting as a canvas for the splatters of history. He ignored the red laser dots dancing across his chest, focusing instead on the way the map of humanity was beginning to pulse with a collective heartbeat. The shroud he was stitching was no longer a garment. It was a living, breathing archive, a tapestry of flesh that contained the genetic screams of an empire. He saw a young officer drop his weapon, paralyzed by the sight of his own reflection in a discarded pool of blood, only to see a face from the Industrial Revolution staring back at him from a piece of skin crawling up his boot. The heritage was claiming the room, weaving the present into its ancient, hungry fabric. Edmund's aquiline nose twitched as the scent of old parchment and fresh iron intensified, a sensory overload that signaled the final stage of the merger. He had successfully turned Beverly Hills into a satellite of the British Museum's darkest basement, a place where the elite were finally forced to carry the weight of the history they had so desperately tried to buy. With a final decisive movement, Edmund drove the bone needle through the center of the map, anchoring the entire grisly assembly to the heart of a fallen icon. The le déclic was complete. The transformation was no longer a process, but a permanent state of being. The ballroom was silent now, save for the wet, rhythmic thumping of the reconstructed flesh and the distant, frantic chatter of police radios. The officers stood frozen, their tactical training useless against a horror that functioned on the level of historical trauma. Edmund looked down at his work, a sense of profound completion washing over him as the heritage skin began to glow with a faint, bioluminescent light, the enzyme having reached its terminal phase. He had created a bridge made of screams and skin, a monument to the endurance of the past. As the lead detective stepped forward, his voice trembling as he began to read the Miranda rights, Edmund didn't listen. He was watching the way the skin of a long-dead king was beginning to knit itself onto the arm of a waiter, the ancient royal sigils blooming like bruises on the young man's flesh. The past was not behind them. It was upon them, literally and figuratively. Edmund Sterling smiled, a thin, clinical expression that revealed nothing of the madness or the genius within. And as he raised his silver surgical scissors to the light, he prepared for the final cut that would separate the world of the living from the world of the preserved forever. The sirens were loud now, a cacophony of the modern world trying to assert its dominance. But as the first piece of the map began to whisper in a forgotten dialect of Old English, Edmund knew that the heritage had already won, and the real gallery was only just beginning to open its doors to an unsuspecting, terrified public. The air in the Beverly Hills mansion didn't just smell of copper and ozone. It tasted of centuries-old dust and the bitter tang of the Thames. Detective Miller stepped through the threshold of the ballroom, his boots squelching on what he first thought was discarded silk, only to realize he was treading upon the discarded identities of the Hollywood elite. Amidst the carnage of wet, raw muscle and pulsing veins, Edmund Sterling stood as a pillar of terrifying stillness. His white laboratory coat was a canvas of visceral art, splattered with the high society blood that was now feeding the ancient grafts. The map of humanity hung behind him, a grotesque tapestry of British nobility stitched onto the fresh, sun-tanned dermis of starlets. As the tactical lights cut through the neon haze, Edmund didn't flinch. He adjusted his silk cravat with a steady, skeletal hand, his icy blue eyes fixed on the way a fragment of 18th-century Earl was currently migrating up a SWAT officer's neck. The enzyme was a wildfire, and he was the only one who knew the geography of the burn. The transition from the mansion to the high-security ward was not a journey toward justice, but a procession of the damned. As the sirens wailed across the Los Angeles basin, the Heritage began its true colonization. In the ambulances, the paramedics screamed as the skin they tried to stabilize began to speak low, guttural whispers in Middle English, demanding the return of lands and titles lost 500 years ago. Edmund sat in the back of the transport vehicle, his wrists cuffed, yet he looked like a king in a carriage. He watched the city through the reinforced glass, seeing not the neon lights of the Sunset Strip, but a flickering overlay of the London Blitz, the Great Fire, and the Roman foundations. To him, the merger was a triumph of texture over time. He had successfully grafted the weight of history onto a culture of the superficial. Every starlet who had sought eternal beauty was now a walking reliquary, their bodies no longer their own, but vessels for the ghosts of the old world. Within the sterile, white-tiled confines of the Twin Towers Correctional Facility's psychiatric wing, the Le Nouveau Départ took root. The world outside was in a state of medical emergency. The CDC and the FBI were powerless against a disease that was essentially a historical haunting made flesh. Surgeons who attempted to debride the grafts found that the skin fought back, the silver surgical scissors of the world's best doctors snapping against the reinforced heritage tissue. Edmund, meanwhile, spent his hours in his cell with a singular focus. He had no tools, no bone needles, no silver thread, yet he used his own fingernails to etch the blueprints of the next phase into the plaster walls. He was no longer just a restorer. He was an architect of the post-human. He watched with clinical detachment as his own pale, waxy skin began to react to the environment, the translucent layers thinning until the blue map of his veins looked like a roadmap to a city that hadn't been built yet. The finality of his incarceration was an illusion. Each night, the guards would hear a rhythmic, wet slapping sound coming from his cell, the sound of Edmund kneading the air, or perhaps the very molecules of his surroundings. The heritage had spread beyond the ballroom. It was in the water, in the very concept of the city. The elite of Los Angeles were now a collective museum, their screams harmonizing into a grand, operatic history of pain. As the sun rose over the Pacific, Edmund Sterling stood at his small, barred window. He felt the history of the world vibrating in his fingertips. He had turned the City of Angels into a gallery of the grotesque, a monument where the past didn't just haunt the present, it wore it. The new departure wasn't about escaping. It was about the fact that there was nowhere left to go where the skin didn't remember. He was the curator of a world that had finally, painfully, become a single, unified masterpiece of suffering and bone. The skin has spoken, and the gallery is finally complete. But what happens when the museum starts to breathe on its own? Thank you for following Edmund's descent. Subscribe, like, and comment to join our dark archive. The next nightmare begins tomorrow at 2 p.m.